September of 1962, North Atlantic. The Norwegian Sea seemed motionless, a gray surface of water and wind that hid beneath it a completely different world. More than 200 miles from the coast, the Soviet submarine B-75, a Foxtrot-class boat, advanced at medium depth between temperature layers that distorted sound. Inside the metal hull, the air smelled of oil and metal, and every thump of the recirculation pumps felt like the pulse of a sleeping giant animal. Captain Leonid Turov leaned over the passive sonar. The screen showed almost flat lines. Only the constant murmur of the ocean and the vibration of their own propellers filled the headphones. It was a routine mission to patrol the routes of the North Atlantic and check whether the Americans were increasing their activity near Iceland. Silence was their protection. But that night, silence broke. The sonar operator lifted his head. "Commander, I've got something." Turov stepped closer, frowning. "What kind of signal?" "I don't know. It's rhythmic, constant, like a pulse." In the headphones, a distant sound emerged and faded. A deep, almost imperceptible echo repeated at regular intervals. It wasn't a whale or an ocean current. It was something made by human hands, something designed. "What the hell's that?" asked another officer from the navigation console. The captain shrugged and set the headphones aside. "Nothing. American noise. Underwater propaganda. Laughter mixed with the hum of the machines." The men convinced themselves it was interference, perhaps a radio experiment or a sonar test from NATO ships. The B-75 continued its course westward, unaware that that sound would be heard again for decades in every ocean on the planet. Thousands of kilometers away, on the coast of the state of Maine, technician James Whittaker, 23 years old, was pulling a night shift at a newly opened United States Navy station. In front of him, a magnetic tape reel turned slowly, while the needles of the oscillographs traced waves on continuous paper. The sea, for Whittaker, was a language of frequencies, roars of storms, creaks of ice, the deep song of cetaceans. But that night, something different appeared in the record, a low, steady pattern with a perfect mechanical cadence. He adjusted the receiver gain. The pulse repeated, regular as a heartbeat. "Control, this is Brunswick Station," he said over the intercom. "We have a new acoustic signature on line 2. It's not natural." In the silence that followed, the keys of another console could be heard activating. Across the room, a senior officer watched the graphs. "That's not a whale, son. That's an engine." Whittaker smiled, incredulous. They had caught a Soviet submarine from the other side of the Atlantic. What neither he nor Captain Turov could know was that that coincidence would mark the beginning of a completely new war, a war waged in darkness and sound. Beyond it, the ocean floor, a secret network of microphones was beginning to awaken. The Soviets would call it an American fantasy, an impossible waste. But very soon, they would discover that the ocean had ears as well. Between 1949 and 1953, the planet learned to live under a new physical law, the possibility of instant destruction. The Soviet Union had tested its first atomic bomb, and with it, the United States' nuclear monopoly vanished. Cities that had once considered themselves invulnerable became imaginary targets, maps filled with red circles drawn over Washington, Moscow, and London. Humanity entered an era in which survival was measured in minutes. In that setting, the seas ceased to be only trade routes or naval battlefields. They became the intermediate space between the two superpowers, a frontier as vast as the fear that separated them. The United States remained the undisputed master of the oceans. Its carrier fleet covered the Pacific and the Atlantic like a skin of steel. The Soviet Union, by contrast, dominated the Eurasian landmass, an immense territory without direct access to the open ocean. For Moscow, the sea was both a threat and a promise. Pentagon strategists understood it before anyone else. If the Soviets managed to deploy submarines with missiles capable of approaching the United States coastline, distance would cease to be a protection. A single launch from the North Atlantic could reach New York in less than 20 minutes. That idea became an obsession in Washington. Every wave, every echo on sonar could hide the beginning of the end. Meanwhile, in Kremlin offices, another fear grew. The vulnerability of its fleet to American surveillance. U.S. ships patrolled all strategic straits, the Danish, the Bering, the Turkish, while Soviet submarines were confined to enclosed seas, the Baltic, the Black, the Barents. Soviet admirals dreamed of breaking that encirclement, of slipping into the Atlantic and disappearing beneath the immensity of the waters, invisible and untouchable. It was in those years that both sides realized the war of the future would not be fought on the surface, but in the darkness of the ocean. The United States began to study the acoustic behavior of the sea, to record the planet's natural noises, the cracking of polar ice, the deep currents, the echoes of underwater mountains. Every sound could become information. The USSR, for its part, accelerated construction of its first long-range diesel submarines, proud of a technology it believed sufficient to evade any surveillance. But the balance was asymmetric. America possessed industrial experience and mastery of global communications, the Soviet Union, the will to defy the impossible. In internal U.S. Navy documents, an analyst wrote a phrase that summed up the spirit of the time. They have men, we have oceans. In the following years, those oceans would become a field of continuous espionage. Satellites did not yet exist. Radars had limited range, but sound traveled through water with a fidelity that astonished even scientists. A single propeller, turning thousands of kilometers away, was enough for a hidden network of microphones to hear it. The sea became a board, its currents the lines of contact, and silence the new form of camouflage. Between the surface and the depths, the invisible frontier of the Cold War was drawn. A frontier without light, without witnesses, and without second chances. At the beginning of the 1950s, the sea ceased to be only the territory of ships and began to be seen as a medium of information. In U.S. Navy offices and at Bell Laboratories, a group of scientists and officers designed a project so ambitious it seemed like science fiction, Caesar. Its purpose was not to sink submarines, but to listen to them. If achieved, the entire ocean could become a global surveillance system. The principle was simple, almost poetic. Sound travels through water with a purity that air cannot match. At certain depths, between 800 and 1,200 meters, there is a stable layer of pressure and temperature, the SOFAR channel, where acoustic waves move for thousands of kilometers without dispersing. A noise generated in the North Atlantic could be detected with sufficient sensitivity from the Caribbean. All that was needed was to create the right ears. Thus was born SOSUS, Sound Surveillance System, a network of undersea cables hundreds of kilometers long, stretched like roots over the ocean floor. Each cable ended in an array of directional microphones, the hydrophones, which captured the subtlest vibrations of the sea, the friction of currents, the echoes of ice, and the metallic murmur of a propeller. The signals traveled along the cables to secret coastal stations, where technicians translated them into paper oscillograms. There, in those lines, one could distinguish whales, storms, or, with a good ear, the heartbeat of a Soviet engine. In 1954, the first nodes were installed off the coasts of Bermuda and Newfoundland. Operators knew them by nondescript names, Station 1, Station 2, but they knew they were connected to something much larger, a network that, if it worked, could listen to everything that moved beneath the sea. The first real test came 3 years later. In 1957, the Soviet Union carried out an underwater nuclear detonation in the Arctic, near Novaya Zemlya. The blast ran through the ocean like a deep sigh. Hours later, the hydrophones at the Newfoundland station recorded the echo with astonishing clarity. For the first time in history, a country had listened to an explosion thousands of kilometers away, traveling through the planet's liquid skin. The scientists at Bell Labs analyzed the data in disbelief. The calculations were exact. The sound had traveled more than 4,000 kilometers and still kept its original form. The confirmation was immediate. The system worked. SOSUS had shown that the sea could speak and that the United States already knew how to listen. The success was kept secret. Official reports described the project as an oceanographic research program. But in the sealed rooms of naval bases, technicians knew they were part of something different. Each new cable laid, each node activated, was another ear connected to the same body. The ocean turned into a surveillance instrument. The Soviets did not yet know it, but from that moment on, silence no longer belonged to them. The ocean's silence had been broken. In 1958, SOSUS already extended like a copper spiderweb beneath the North Atlantic. Coastal stations operated day and night, staffed by young operators learning to read the sea as others read a language. Among them was Richard Edmonds, a civilian engineer with the Navy, a thin, methodical man with almost obsessive patience. He had begun his career designing concrete structures, but found his calling in something intangible: sound. Edmonds believed that every submarine had its own acoustic fingerprint, an unmistakable timbre, like a voice. He spent hours reviewing magnetic tapes, comparing patterns, tuning his ear until he could distinguish Soviet propellers from those of Norwegian fishing vessels. His office was a mix of laboratory and confessional, piles of tapes, cups of coffee, diagrams full of frequency lines. He said the ocean spoke in a language only those who knew how to listen calmly could understand. In Navy meetings, his superiors often looked at him with distrust. Many still believed wars were won with ships and missiles, not with microphones. In one system evaluation session, an admiral asked ironically whether SOSUS could tell a whale from a submarine. Edmonds, without raising his voice, replied, "We don't need to see them, only to hear them, and the ocean doesn't lie." While on the east coast of the United States, the Navy was learning to listen, on the other side of the world, another man devoted his life to the same art. Lieutenant Commander Ivan Korolev, an officer of the Soviet Northern Fleet, led an anti-submarine operations group in the Barents Sea. It was a cruel sea of black waters and endless storms where sonar echoes mixed with the roars of splitting ice. Korolev had been trained in the hard tradition of the post-war years. His father, a veteran of the defense of Leningrad, had taught him that discipline was the only protection against chaos. Even so, Korolev shared with Edmonds an identical trait: obsession. He spent nights in the sonar room, headphones on, analyzing the echoes returning from the depths. He had learned to recognize the rhythm of the sea, the sound of ice scraping a hull, the hollow voice of underwater mountains. However, he despised the Americans' acoustic projects. When intelligence reports mentioned the existence of a network of cables in the Atlantic, Korolev laughed. "You can't fill the sea with microphones and call it defense," he told his men. "The ocean swallows everything. Sound is lost, confused, it lies. No one can hear it all." That certainty gave him peace of mind. His job was to hunt silences, not fear them. He believed the Americans were wasting their time trying to listen to a world too vast. What he did not know was that in the labs at Bell, Edmonds had shown the opposite. The oceans were not chaos, but an ordered system, an immense symphony with its own laws. You only needed to know at what frequency to listen. Two men, separated by a continent and an ideology, worked on the same mystery. Neither knew the other's name, but both shared the same conviction: that the future of war would not be decided by bombs, but by the ability to hear before the enemy. While Korolev tuned his sonar in the icy waters of the Arctic, Edmonds calibrated a spectrogram at a base in Maine. The two listened to the same ocean, and without knowing it, they were destined to meet through it. In 1958, when SOSUS was beginning to be woven beneath the Atlantic, there were those who took it as a technical curiosity and others who saw it as a new language. In a small windowless office on the coast of Maine, civilian engineer Richard Edmonds spent nights in front of his tape recorders. He was thin, quiet, and believed every machine had a sound signature as precise as a fingerprint. On his desk were stacked recording tapes, cold cups of coffee, and sheets covered with frequency lines. He called those curves the ocean's voices. In a meeting with Navy officers, an admiral interrupted him. "Do you really think a few cables can watch an entire ocean?" Edmonds answered without looking at the papers. "We don't need to see them, sir, only to hear them." On the other side of the planet, in the Barents Sea, a man of the same temper tuned his own ear. Lieutenant Commander Ivan Korolev of the Northern Fleet was the son of a wartime pilot and a field nurse. He had learned to trust his ear more than instruments. In those icy waters, a sound could be the difference between life and shipwreck. He spent nights in the sonar room, coat over his shoulders, listening to the echoes of ice and rocky seabed. When intelligence reports mentioned that the Americans were deploying an acoustic network beneath the Atlantic, Korolev burst out laughing. "You can't fill the sea with microphones and call it defense," he told his second. "Maybe the Americans don't know that." "Worse," he replied. "Maybe they believe they can hear everything." Neither man knew the other's name, but they shared the same obsession: listening. For Edmonds, the sea was a code to decipher. For Korolev, an enemy to be learned to ignore. Both thought the other side overvalued its own technology. While in Maine, analysts learned to distinguish the beat of a propeller among 1,000 noises, in the Arctic, the Soviets remained convinced that sound would dissolve in the immensity of the water. Two men, two shores, one frequency. The sea united them, though each believed he heard only his own echo. During the 1960s, the Soviet Union experienced its great naval awakening. Under Admiral Sergei Gorshkov, the Red Fleet went from a coastal force to a global instrument. Gorshkov dreamed of matching the maritime power of the United States and saw in submarines the perfect means to achieve it. In his reports to the Politburo, he spoke of steel, speed, and deterrence. "The domination of the seas will be the domination of the 20th century," he wrote, and Moscow believed him. The shipyards of Severodvinsk, Komsomolsk, and Vladivostok worked without rest. Out of them came the new colossi of the depths, the Whiskey, Foxtrot, and Hotel classes, and later the Yankee, equipped with ballistic missiles. They were enormous, robust, capable of sailing for weeks, but also terribly noisy. Engineers knew that power had a price. Steam turbines, diesel generators, and multi-bladed propellers produced a constant roar, an echo that traveled through water much farther than the manuals admitted. In Moscow, no one worried about that. The official doctrine claimed the ocean was too vast to be watched, that no microphone or radar could control its thousands of kilometers of depth. "Sound dissolves in the immensity of the sea," Gorshkov declared at a 1964 conference. "No ear can reach us." That phrase became a motto within the Soviet Navy, a truth repeated so many times that few dared question it. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Atlantic, SOSUS operators listened. From stations in the Azores, Bermuda, and Argentia in Newfoundland, the ocean was no longer an acoustic desert, but a map of living sounds. Each type of Soviet submarine had a distinct vibration pattern. The propellers of the Foxtrot class turned at 210 revolutions per minute. Those of the Hotel produced a deeper hum, and the new nuclear units generated a metallic rhythm that technicians nicknamed the Red Drum. Analysts could tell a Soviet submarine without seeing it, just by listening to the cadence of its engines. They had learned to identify the tone of a cooling pump, the timbre of a faulty valve, the squeal caused by a bent blade. In the listening rooms, the ocean was a staff, and every enemy ship a recognizable melody. In 1966, an internal U.S. Navy report described the situation with unsettling precision. "We can follow them for days without their knowing it. For every propeller, there is a record. For every record, a name." On the other side of the world, Gorshkov remained convinced of his invisibility. He believed power was measured in tons of steel, not in decibels. While he ordered the construction of more submarines, larger, faster, noisier, the U.S. Navy perfected the art of hearing them breathe. Soviet pride was measured in brute force, the American in silence. And at the bottom of the Atlantic, that silence was beginning to win. By the mid-60s, SOSUS had gone from experiment to strategic tool. The U.S. Navy no longer depended on chance or endless patrols to find enemy submarines. Now it could listen to them. The oceans, which for centuries had been territories of invisibility, were transformed into a network of audible routes. The system covered the Atlantic like a living fabric. Cables stretched from Greenland to Puerto Rico, crossing the Labrador Sea, the Azores, and Bermuda. At each point, hundreds of hydrophones formed chains that captured low-frequency sounds, inaudible to the human ear but perfectly recognizable to machines. Signals traveled by fiber and copper to onshore analysis centers, where technicians translated the noise of the sea into military information. The doctrinal change was radical. Until then, anti-submarine destroyers and frigates had to chase fleeting echoes with active sonar, exposing themselves in burning fuel. With SOSUS, the Navy could do the opposite. Wait. It detected Soviet submarines thousands of kilometers away, traced their path hours or even days in advance, and sent the nearest interceptors to cut them off. It was passive hunting, invisible, perfect. In the listening rooms, the walls were covered with continuous paper spectrograms, long bands of lines that looked like heartbeats. Young operators, trained by Edmonds and his team, learned to recognize patterns as if they were musical notes. There was a deep murmur that belonged to the foxtrots, an irregular hum characteristic of the hotels, and a steady whistle that betrayed the new Yankee-class nuclear submarines. One winter night at the Bermuda station, a novice operator lifted his head from his console. "How do we know it's them?" he asked. His instructor, a petty officer with 20 years of service, didn't take his eyes off the monitor. "Because no one else sounds like that." In Washington, the Pentagon understood it possessed more than a detection system. It had an acoustic map of the enemy. Every Soviet submarine left an identifiable trail, a sort of biological signature. Even when they tried to sail in silence, there was always a tiny detail that betrayed them. The knocking of the shaft, the resonance of the metal, a propeller that didn't turn quite true. Analysts began to file those sound signatures as if they were fingerprints. Each detected submarine was assigned a number and a recording. If it reappeared months later, a few seconds of listening were enough to identify it. By 1968, SOSUS records exceeded 2,000 hours of classified recordings. Each tape represented a Soviet ship that had believed it passed unnoticed. The system wasn't infallible, but it became omnipresent. In the offices of the Admiralty, maps of the Atlantic filled with lines and circles indicating acoustic routes. The United States not only knew the movements of the enemy fleet, it could predict them. Surface sailors called SOSUS Neptune's ear. Intelligence officers, more pragmatic, defined it with another phrase: "We listen, they hide." And in the depths, Soviet submarines kept advancing, unaware that every turn of their propellers was a confession. By the mid-60s, SOSUS had ceased to be an experiment and had become a silent weapon. The Americans understood they no longer needed to track the enemy. It was enough to listen. The Navy stopped searching for echoes on the surface to hear the pulse of the entire ocean. The cables now stretched from the coasts of Greenland to Puerto Rico, passing through Newfoundland, the Azores, and Bermuda. Over thousands of kilometers, hundreds of hydrophones captured low-frequency sounds sliding along the SOFAR channel. The signals reached shore stations where operators transformed them into lines of frequency and rhythm. The doctrinal shift was immediate. Destroyers no longer patrolled blindly, they waited. When an acoustic signature appeared on the map, command centers plotted its course, projected its speed, and sent interception units to cut it off. The enemy did not yet know it, but the United States could follow it for days without emitting a single ping of sonar. At the Argenia base, a young operator tilted his head over the console. "How do we know it's them?" The veteran petty officer didn't even lift his eyes from the graph. "Because no one else sounds like that." Every submarine had its own voice. The Foxtrots generated a dry, almost metallic pulse. The hotels, a deep, sustained hum. The Yankees, an irregular buzz that vibrated like an out-of-tune note. Navy technicians would file those recordings as if they were fingerprints. From the sound of an engine, they knew the type of vessel, the class, even the maintenance state of its propellers. In Washington, strategists understood the scope of the discovery. SOSUS did not only listen, it mapped. The oceans, which had always been the refuge of stealth, became a transparent space. The Soviets still believed the immensity of the Atlantic protected them. They did not know their movements were being recorded on magnetic tape, labeled with date and coordinates. The people who ran the system named it with respect and fear: Neptune's ear. In the silence of the seabed, the United States had found its definitive advantage. The enemy sailed in darkness, and every turn of its propellers sounded like a confession. During the 1970s, SOSUS reached maturity. It was already a global network, but it remained an absolute secret. Reports about its existence were kept in numbered boxes, sealed with 3 levels of classification. On official Navy maps, the cables appeared under false names, or were replaced by civilian communications routes. Not even the closest NATO allies knew its true extent or exact purpose. The men and women who worked in the coastal stations lived within that institutional silence. They could not talk about their work with anyone, not even their families. To the public, they were oceanographers or communications technicians. In reality, they spent nights in front of green screens and tape machines, listening to the deepest sounds on the planet. The shifts were long, the noises endless. The creaking of Arctic ice, the roar of tropical storms, the distant echo of underwater earthquakes. And amid all that chaos, they searched for a single pattern, the steady rhythm of a metal propeller turning in the dark. One veteran operator explained it years later. "We had no missiles, no weapons, no glory. We only had ears." Within the Navy, project personnel had given the system an unofficial name, the Ear of God. Not because it was infallible, but because it listened without being seen, everywhere at once. It was a silent presence that spread beneath the oceans, watchful and patient, waiting for the sound of human error. Meanwhile, in Moscow, the Soviet Union still failed to grasp the magnitude of what it faced. Its submarines crossed the Atlantic confident in the immensity of the sea. Commanders believed currents, storms, and the noise of their own engines hid their movements. Engineers insisted that no acoustic system could distinguish a submarine within the chaotic symphony of the ocean. Admiral Gorshkov continued to repeat his phrase, "Sound dissolves in the immensity of the sea." No one dared contradict him, but on the other side of the world, in the sealed rooms of SOSUS stations, analysts recorded every Soviet voyage with clockmaker's precision. They knew when they left Murmansk, when they crossed the Danish Strait, when they turned south off Iceland. They could even estimate the type of mission by the cadence of the engines and the pauses in navigation. The ocean, which for the Soviets was their refuge, had become their mirror, and every vibration produced by their fleet was recorded on magnetic tapes, archived, labeled, stored in silence. On the surface, the world still believed the seas were free and unfathomable. In the depths, they were already occupied. By the mid-1970s, the Soviet illusion of invisibility began to crumble. In 1974, a classified GRU report mentioned for the first time what had until then seemed a conspiracy theory. The Americans had built an underwater listening network that spanned the entire Atlantic and part of the Pacific. The fragments of information came from disparate sources: aerial photographs of coastal facilities, testimonies of Icelandic fishermen who found remnants of cut cables, and above all, growing evidence that Soviet submarines were being detected with inexplicable ease. The impact in Moscow was immediate. Naval engineers understood that power was no longer measured only in size or strength, but in silence. The shipyards of Severodvinsk and Komsomolsk received direct orders: design a submarine that could not be heard. A new phase of frantic research began. Hulls were covered with anechoic panels, rubber sheets specially formulated to absorb sound rather than reflect it. Propellers were redesigned with more blades, curved and asymmetrical, to eliminate cavitation. Engineers measured every vibration, every leak of noise, as if measuring the breathing of a living creature. The race for stealth had begun. The first results were promising. The Victor III-class submarines, and later the Akulas, reduced their acoustic signature to less than half that of their predecessors. In Ministry of Defense reports, there was proud talk of a new generation of silent hunters. Admiral Gorshkov proclaimed that the ocean would belong to them again. But reality, once more, moved faster than the speeches. In the same period, SOSUS evolved in silence. Old tape recorders were replaced by digital processors, hydrophones by more sensitive and resilient broadband sensors. Analysis computers could now recognize propulsion patterns with a precision impossible a few years earlier. The rhythm of a piston, the frequency of an electric motor, even the particular resonance of a poorly balanced screw. Each submarine still had its own voice, but the American ear had become keener. In an internal Navy meeting, Richard Edmonds, now a veteran, gray-haired and sleepless, summed up the situation with a phrase that would be repeated in every report: "Silence also leaves footprints." SOSUS operators confirmed it night after night. Although the new Soviet submarines were more discreet, they still produced a minimal murmur, a barely perceptible vibration at the lowest frequency of the spectrum. A few hours of recording were enough for the computers to find the pattern. Where once there had been a metallic roar, now there was a sigh, but a sigh that could be tracked. The Soviets believed they had regained stealth. The Americans knew they had only changed pitch. The game remained the same, only now it was played at frequencies beyond human hearing. Submarine warfare entered its most invisible phase. It was no longer a battle of fleets, but of echoes. The ocean once again became the largest and quietest battlefield on Earth. In the autumn of 1981, the Soviet Northern Fleet launched a test mission intended to prove to the world and to itself that the new generation of silent submarines could evade SOSUS. The chosen vessel was K-324, an imposing Victor III-class submarine, pride of the Severodvinsk shipyards. Its commander, Captain Anatoly Antonenko, received direct orders from the Admiralty: sail from Murmansk toward the North Atlantic, maintain maximum stealth, and remain invisible throughout the crossing. If the enemy did not detect it, it would be the definitive proof that the USSR had regained control of the ocean. K-324 left Kola Bay at dawn, shrouded in fog. The men on board were confident. The new anechoic coatings on the hull absorbed sound. Effectively, the redesigned propellers reduced cavitation noise, and the internal sonar showed an empty ocean. The Soviets believed they moved like ghosts beneath the surface, certain that no ear could reach them. But on the second day of the voyage, more than 3,000 miles away, a SOSUS station in Bermuda picked up something. On one of the lowest frequency lines, a faint, almost imperceptible pulse appeared, repeating every few seconds. Operators compared it with routine logs. It was not commercial traffic nor natural noise. It was mechanical, regular, human. Within minutes, the stations in Newfoundland and the Azores confirmed the signal. 3 points on the map, a precise triangulation. The system had located a contact moving slowly, heading southwest at medium depth. The computers calculated its position with a margin of error of less than 20 miles. Richard Edmonds, already retired but still an advisor to the program, was called in to review the recording. He listened to the tape with the headphones resting on the desk, in absolute silence. After several minutes, he smiled in disbelief. On the frequency spectrum, one detail repeated exactly: an irregular knock in the propeller's rotation, a slight imbalance in one of the blades. That imperfection, so small it was invisible to the Soviets themselves, was enough to identify the submarine as a Victor III. At U.S. bases, the information was processed and sent to the top ranks of the CIA and the Navy. The technical report described the finding coolly, but the last line had a different tone. They sailed in secret. We heard them from the other side of the world. Weeks later, in Moscow, the Admiralty received a document leaked through Western intelligence channels. It contained the same acoustic record that had been captured by SOSUS, with the exact sound signature of K-324. No one understood how the Americans had obtained such a precise recording, nor how they could know the mechanical defects of a propeller manufactured in a Soviet shipyard. The silence in the room was total. A vice admiral closed the report without a word. Gorshkov, already old, understood that his maxim, "no ear can reach us," had become obsolete. For the Soviets, it was a covert humiliation. For the Americans, the definitive confirmation of an invisible victory. SOSUS had demonstrated its power without firing a single torpedo. It had listened to the enemy from the other side of the world, and had done so with such exact precision that not even the ocean could hide it. From then on, underwater war changed in nature. The Soviet Union stopped mocking the system and began to fear it. The sea was still immense, but it was no longer silent. The ocean had memory, and it listened. Dawn falls over the North Atlantic. In a small concrete coastal station, lost among cliffs and rusted antennas, a young operator reviews old files. The war is already over. The SOSUS system has been modernized for years, but there are still tapes no one has listened to since the days of the Cold War. On a metal shelf, each box is marked with numbers and coordinates, dates, frequencies, seas, history stored in magnetism. The operator inserts one of those tapes into an old player. The reel begins to turn, and the room fills with a low, almost imperceptible hum. It is the sound of a Soviet propeller from the 1960s, captured thousands of kilometers away, recorded by a cable that no longer exists. The noise is monotonous, steady, and yet it has something human, the slow breathing of a steel giant that sailed, believing itself invisible. Outside, the ocean is calm. The waves strike the breakwater gently, as if the sea breathed the same way it did in those recordings. The operator closes his eyes for a moment and wonders how many men, on both sides of the world, spent their lives beneath that surface, believing that silence was protection. He thinks of the Soviet captains who plowed the Atlantic, convinced that the sea's noise covered them, of the American technicians who spent entire nights deciphering patterns, dreaming of propellers and frequencies. Two worlds opposed, joined by the same ocean, by the same obsession to listen and be listened to. The tape ends. The sound fades. Only the faint click of the reel stopping remains, like a heartbeat that ceases. The young man turns off the equipment, goes outside, and looks at the horizon. The sun begins to rise in the east, tinting the water copper. In that instant, he understands that what he heard was not only military history, but the voice of the sea itself, witness to a war fought without anyone seeing it. The Soviet Union mocked SOSUS, believing the ocean was too big to have ears. But the ocean never forgets, and sometimes even silence has memory.